Today, I want to talk a little bit about the virtue of trust. Um, Before I do so, I'll give us a little bit of an outline as to where we're heading today, and just say for a moment a little about why I think this is so important. We certainly within the Christian faith, within the daily rhythms of the church, think a lot about trust and faith and how we entrust others with information, but with tasks as well. And oftentimes, at least for me in my own faith development, I found that I initially in the early stages of faith thought a lot about trust as something that I could will into action, just sort of make myself trust enough, and I would trust. And what I hope to share with you today is a little bit of the ways in which, through one very particular lens, which is the lens of psychology, which is one of multiple different lenses with its own flaws, but also, I think, its own capacity to reveal some helpful truths about how we interact with one another. Through the lens of psychology, came to realize how much of trust in particular is not just about willing oneself to do it, but has to do with the ways in which we ourselves were entrusted, and the kind of environments that we set up for ourselves or that others set up for us. So today, whenever, and I said this last time that I spoke, whenever I think about virtues in general, I'm reminded of Oliver Wendell Holmes' statement about simplicity and complexity. So those of you who were here last time, this is a statement that I love to just begin with. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "I wouldn't give a fig for the simplicity that lies on this side of complexity." In other words, a sort of simple, pat answer about what trust is and how you go about trusting. But I would give my life for the simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity. And so my goal today, as with each one of these in the series, is to move from a more simplistic understanding of what trust is or how we think about it. We'll dip our toes in some complexity today, but my hope is when we come back on the other side to have a more elegant simplicity, both thinking about what trust is, and in particular, how as pastors we might go about helping to cultivate that within our congregation. So in the first half of the hour, what I'm going to do, for those of you who were here last time, some of this first part may be a bit of a review, but I think it's helpful to distinguish between virtues and values. And then I'll propose a particular anatomy of a virtue and take you through that in generally. I'll highlight a couple of other virtues that we will continue to explore in the coming months before turning to a deeper examination of trust itself. Then I want to distinguish trust as a way of relating from two other different ways that we can sometimes habitually fall into relating. That of what's called sometimes symbiosis or anxiously connecting with other people, and avoidance or maintaining kind of distant acquaintanceships rather than trusting relationships. And then I'll define trust as a virtue. At that point, I'll pause probably about halfway through the hour, maybe a little bit before then, for any kind of questions you have. And then for the remaining part of the hour, using some of psychological research, especially research on what's called attachment, I'll try to outline the anatomy of a trusting interaction. What happens even before we move into an interaction? What's happening at the emotional level, at the perceptual level, and then at the behavioral level as we entrust another person with elements of our lives. We'll try to identify a couple ways in which that process can get hung up, some obstacles, and then ideally end the hour by talking about a few more simple, straightforward ways to try to overcome some of those obstacles. So I plan to speak for about 50 or 60 minutes, ideally in two segments, and then we'll pause both midway as well as at least one time for questions at the end, maybe another one partway through, depending on how I'm rambling in that time. So ultimately, I'll move through a little bit of complexity, but hoping to end us in that place of simplicity at the end. So, oftentimes we conflate the two concepts of virtues and values, but they're fundamentally different from one another. I'll define, again, for some of you, define a value using a definition by Shalom Schwartz, who is one of the leading value researchers. He's been looking at values across multiple hundreds of countries now in the world over the span of about 40 years. And he defines values as trans-situational goals, so goals that we have not just in a workplace or in a congregational setting, but a value that transcends situations. These values vary in importance, meaning we prioritize some as higher than others. And these goals serve as guiding principles in the life of a person or a social entity. In other words, values are enduring goals that operate across contexts, whether at home, at work, school, or church. So they vary in both priority and they function as anchor points that help us to decide on particular behaviors, institutions, paths, and strategies. So values are what I will call in just a little bit directional elements of the moral life or the good life. By contrast, a virtue is a habit. It's a habit that's developed over time, a habit, and I'm going to suggest a habit of attention, habits of desire, habits of feeling or emotion states, and habits of behavior that are acquired across time, oftentimes through intentional practice. These virtues enable us to enact what is good or what is right within the very particular context in which we live. And so one way to think about these is as two different systems of morality. So I've used this metaphor before. Briefly, you can imagine our moral system like a ship. And it is one thing to know where we want to go in a ship. You can imagine having a great map, a great GPS system, knowing exactly where you're aiming that ship. But the map alone can't move the vessel. So in other words, the directional system that includes things like values, things like moral reasoning, so in other words, reasoning between values, is good at determining where it is we want to go, but we need something else to motivate us. In other words, to get the engine rolling, the engine, the sails, the rudder, and that's where I'd suggest virtues function. Virtues that include things like intuitions and emotions and skills, and that it's these virtues or these capacities that actually enable us to move toward the values, toward the direction we're aiming. So what is a virtue? A virtue, I will suggest, and there's different ways of unpacking virtues, but I'll suggest that a virtue can be thought of as four interconnected capacities or abilities. First, a virtue enables us to see. In other words, a virtuous person develops perceptual attunement. They see morally relevant cues in the environment where other people might miss them. So for instance, as we talked about last time, the virtue of compassion sensitizes us to signs of another person's suffering or need. And I'll talk about the virtue of trust in a moment. Second, a virtue shapes our desires. It makes us want certain things. So a virtuous person experiences what psychologists call an intuitive impulse. This is that kind of gut feeling we get that's emotionally charged to respond appropriately, whether by approaching a situation, by addressing a particular need. For instance, as we talked about last time, the virtue of compassion activates an impulse to want to relieve suffering. Third, a virtue forms our emotional responses. So in other words, a virtue cultivates habitual feeling states. In other words, feelings that just kind of arise and stay present. And psychologists would suggest, moral psychologists would suggest, it's this feeling state that offers some of that fuel or motivational intensity for behavior. So as we talked about last time with compassion, we experience a unique blend of connection and sorrow when we see someone suffering. And by feeling sorrow, we want to relieve the suffering. And by feeling connection, we want to move toward them. So that unique feeling state within compassion is part of what facilitates this movement to then act. And the final part of a virtue is behavior. A virtue equips us to act in the right way, in the right moment. So in this way, you can think of a virtuous person as someone who possesses like habitual skills, what cognitive psychologists call behavioral scripts. Like as soon as I'm in this moment, it's like my mind is following a script. When someone is injured, this is what I do. And it's those scripts that enable us to almost impulsively act effectively in the right way, in the right circumstances. So for instance, last time we talked about the virtue of compassion involves a variety of different skills of knowing how to relieve suffering when that suffering is different. So the skills of compassion for a medical doctor are different than those of a psychotherapist, are different than those of a kindergarten teacher with a child who's crying. And so having particular behavioral skills or scripts is the fourth part of what it means to be virtuous. So in short, a virtue helps us to see, desire, feel, and do. And a virtuous person, in this way of thinking about it, is someone who is chronically disposed to do these in morally excellent ways. So in the research, in my research that I work on, in my collaboration with colleagues like Michael Leffel and Joel Sagawa, we've looked at multiple different virtues that we believe are related directly to neighbor love. There's lots of complex skills that we use to navigate the relationships around us, but there are a few of them, four in particular, what we call virtues, that tend to predict effective caring for the other, or loving the neighbor. So in our studies of how people grow and their ability to love their neighbor as themselves, we focused on these four virtues. And each one of these arises from an innate motivational system. So as humans, we are innately motivated to be securely close to others. It is, you don't have to teach an infant to want to be held. This is what we're going to talk about today. And it's from this motive to attach securely to others that we develop, or not, the virtue of trust, both the ability to trust others and to prove to be trustworthy ourselves from other people. Last time we talked about when we see another person who's suffering, we are innately motivated to help. And when that ability has been effectively cultivated, that motive to alleviate distress develops into the virtue that we call compassion. We're also motivated towards fairness and reciprocity in our relationships. When we see something, two people treated unequally, we tend to respond against that. And when we develop not only that attunement, but our ability to respond to this tends to motivate the virtue of gratitude. We start to see the give and take in relationships and notice the gifts all around us and express thanks for those. And then finally, the innate motivation that we have to repair broken relationships can be developed into the virtue of forgiveness. And that's actually the virtue that we're going to talk about in the third and final one of these days of learning later on in a month or so. These four virtues are inherently pro-social. In other words, they promote the well-being of others and they promote the health of relationships. And although we're going to focus on trust today, we'll spend a little time, like I said, in a later talk discussing some of the other virtues too. In addition to these four pro-social virtues, there are two what we've called metacognitive capacities. That's kind of a jargony word, so I apologize for it. But metacognitive simply means thinking about thinking. So two other abilities or skills that aren't necessarily pro-social, but when they're paired with these pro-social virtues, they can actually help support our ability to love the other. The first one is what psychologists call mindfulness, what we might call presence. It's simply the ability to just notice what's going on in your own mind and with your own emotional state. And to do that with a sense of curiosity instead of self-criticism or self-judgment. Um, this also involves the ability not just to observe what's going on in our mind, but to act with awareness, to act responsibly instead of compulsively. The second one of these abilities, and we're going to see both these show up as we think about today trust, is empathy, which includes two different dimensions. We talked more about that in the previous conversation. But one of those is affective empathy, which is the sharing of another person's emotions. This happens sometimes without even consciously being aware of it. You just see someone tear up and you feel it yourself. And the second one is cognitive empathy. You could think of this as the top-down empathy, where we think our way into empathizing with another person by taking their perspective. Okay, so I want to take, before I talk anything about trust, I want to take just a minute to have you reflect on a moment in your own life. So to anchor our discussion, take a moment and recall a time in which you felt trust, in which you felt safe or connected to another person. Conjure that image in your mind. It might have been from childhood. It might be with a spouse or significant other, with a friend, with a mentor. Picture what they said and did in that moment. Consider in that moment what they noticed or saw in you that prompted them to make you feel safe. What was it that they noticed in you that allowed them to reach out to you? Try to imagine to yourself what they seemed to desire in that moment. What did they want for you? What was their gut hope in that moment for you? What emotions appeared to move them? Was it compassion? Was it curiosity? Was it excitement and enjoyment? Finally, think about what actions made you feel truly cared for by them. What did they do? What did their face do? What words did they say? What were they doing with their body in space that made you feel cared for and trusting in that moment? So we're going to return to these elements as we examine compassion more closely. But I want to start with a couple of stories. I want to begin actually with a story that I recently heard from my stepfather, Rick. He was in town just a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me about a time. He served in the Vietnam War as a naval officer, and he was stationed on an aircraft carrier. And he was telling me about a time in which he had to, in the middle of the night, take a ship full of other Navy officers from this gigantic, very safe aircraft carrier out to a battleship that was anchored beyond the horizon. They could not see it. No light was visible from this battleship out in the ocean. And so he got all these crew on the boat, and they all started out confident. But it was a multi-hour boat ride from this aircraft carrier out to the other battleship in the pitch black of the night. And so as the minutes and the hours went on, his crewmates became increasingly worried that they were off course. They started to lose confidence, both in the compass that was guiding the ship and in the captain of the ship. He always guided them well, so there was no, in this case, really rational reason for them to panic. But in the ambiguity of the situation, in the dark, they could imagine all sorts of danger. And as they continued, the crew began to suspect that the compass was malfunctioning, and they eventually started begging to turn back. They started arguing with one another about which way was north. And in fact, Rick, my stepdad, was telling me the more that they panicked, the more My stepfather himself began to doubt whether or not he was guiding the ship in the right direction. In other words, this kind of panic or mistrust was contagious. And so finally, the panic reached such a fever pitch that Rick had one of the crewmen dig deep into the hull to pull out this gigantic, very prized, very expensive gimbal stabilized compass that they only used for emergencies, and kind of set it up. And it was only when the crew saw that both compasses pointed in the same direction and that the ship itself was indeed following the correct course that they could feel safe again. Sometimes one source of safety isn't enough. Sometimes in the midst of uncertainty and fear, we need two or more gathered to help us maintain that sense or that feeling of trust, even when we know with our minds that we have a trustworthy guide in our midst. So as he told that story, it actually reminded me of a couple of moments in the life of Peter. So Peter, sorry, let me click past really quick. Peter, we read about in Matthew 14. So I want to begin just with a couple of these, and then we're going to unpack some of the psychological research on trust here. The first comes from Matthew 14, in which Jesus walks across the water of a windy, wavy lake to join his disciples in the boat. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter walked out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. I want to pause and highlight this moment of deep trust, a moment of deep faith that Peter is having in Jesus here. It is fleeting, though, because when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And this is one of the questions I want us to take seriously today. Not as many of us might hear it as merely a rebuke of Peter, but instead, I want to address this question, "Why did you doubt?" with an air of compassionate curiosity. Why do we doubt? Why is trusting for us sometimes difficult? And why is it more difficult for some of us than for others? Or for all of us with some people versus others? I want to move on, though, because we meet Peter again in Matthew 26 as Jesus is about to be delivered into the hands of the chief priests and elders. Jesus told them this very night, "You will all fall away on account of me. For it's written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter, that trusting, then mistrusting, and trusting again disciple, said, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. You are human, Peter, and this is going to happen. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Well, we know what happens next, because we meet Peter again, sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You were also with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Trust dwindles. Then he went out into the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." And he denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." And after a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. Peter remembered the word that Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. Peter, of all the people he mistrusted, why is it that Peter, and why do we fail to trust? It reminds me of the verse we talked about last time from Paul in Romans. I do not understand what I do. Why do I not trust? Why do I lose faith in God sometimes, in other people, in a moment? What I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. But I don't want to stop there. I want to read one last passage, and this time I want to focus on how Jesus entrusts Peter, because Jesus knows this about Peter. He knows his future betrayal. He knows Peter's fleeting trust in and out. But Jesus, and this is back in Matthew 16, says to Peter this, "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was Messiah. I want to take just a moment and unpack this exchange between Jesus and Peter using some of the language that we used before. Jesus in this moment could have seen Peter as an untrustworthy person. And indeed, he does fail in moments of faith and in trustworthiness later on. But Jesus sees beyond Peter's failures. What he perceives in front of him is a person of good intention and good faith, someone who is worthy to be trusted. Not that he's perfect, but he is willing to entrust his church to Peter. Jesus, in this moment, we might think, feels a desire to share something with Peter, to share here his calling, to show truths about himself, to risk inviting Peter in to Jesus's mission in the world. He demonstrates here a feeling that energizes him to approach and to be receptive to who Peter is. And he acts in very particular ways that express an invited trust, including, as should be recalled, both offering opportunities for Peter to invest in his church and drawing boundaries. It is not but 3 verses later, I think, that Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So Jesus is willing to say no and to say yes with this person that he trusts. So in thinking about trust in this way, I want you to think about a time in which maybe you, or maybe you were talking with one of your congregants who wanted to be closer, in a more trusting relationship, you wanted to entrust someone to something, you wanted to approach someone, or they wanted to approach someone, but they failed to do so. When we fail to trust, especially another person, what happens here? What causes this gap between values and actions? And I think sometimes we fail in trust when we develop our directional system, our values, without fully developing our motivational system or those virtues. And so contemporary research has returned to ancient virtue traditions to help explain how this kind of moral motivation actually works. So I want to take a couple moments, unpack the complexity of the virtue of trust, and then we'll pause for a little bit and respond to any questions about that. And then we'll take the tail end of the hour and look at what may go wrong and how we can intervene. So first, I want to differentiate trust from 2 other somewhat related ways of relating. So researchers, and this is oftentimes developmental researchers who look at children and then look at patterns in how adults relate to each other, attachment researchers, have identified at least 3, there's a 4th one that we won't talk about today, but at least 3 different patterns of behavior that we do in relationship with others. One they call symbiosis. And this is when we want, in fact, sometimes even crave togetherness and have a hard time with someone separating from us, or having a hard time being with someone else who is different from us. We want intimacy and closeness, and we actually can be afraid of the autonomy of another person, their separateness from us. When we're operating in this way, what's sometimes called anxious attachment, we try to control other people's loyalty. We set rules for them. We try to keep them close. We try to keep everyone the same. We don't want differences to arise between us in terms of perspectives or views. In this way of relating to other people, differences feel like a threat to the bond. This is not trust. A second way of relating that also can be contrasted with trust is what's called avoidance. This is where we feel really free to explore, to be different, to be distant from other people. We don't need togetherness all the time. And in fact, what I crave when I am more avoidant is I want to be free. I want to be autonomous. And in fact, both for some people, this characterizes their relationships in general, but all of us can move into moments like this where we want freedom and autonomy, and we can even be a little bit afraid of intimacy and closeness. So when we're in this mode, or people who are chronically in this mode, tend to avoid being vulnerable, tend to avoid disclosing things about their lives to others, and they control their own internal emotional state by distancing, by staying independent from others. These people they can still look social. In fact, individuals who are avoidant oftentimes have many acquaintances, but they have few people who really know them deeply. So in contrast to both these, trust can be thought of as that ability to prize both togetherness and exploration. It's that feeling state we get in the set of behaviors that results when we're comfortable with intimacy and vulnerability, and when we're comfortable with autonomy and difference and separateness. Part of what allows us to be comfortable with that is we can believe in the trustworthiness of the other person, even when they're physically absent from us. And it's in this way of entrusting others that differences become not threats to the relationship, but actually they're seen as complementary. And in fact, your difference from me can even be a source of my own growth. So I start to see differences as being necessary and helpful. So one way to define trust is through the emotion state that we feel. This comes out of attachment researchers Shaver and Michelancer's writing. They think of trust as an acquired, generalized tendency to experience an abiding sense of attachment security. And it should be noted, this feeling state that we get is learned. It is based on what we've actually experienced in relationships. And this feeling promotes a pervasive faith in other people's goodwill, a general sense of being loved, of being understood, esteemed, and accepted by relational partners. And it involves generally optimistic beliefs about being able to handle frustration and distress. So this isn't a Pollyannish view of everyone's going to be nice all the time, but part of what attachment security involves, a sense of trust involves, is a feeling that I will be able to tolerate and navigate through difficulties and disappointments as well. So if we're going to define trust as a virtue, trust involves a particular way of seeing. It sensitizes us to seeing the good intentions of others, the imago Dei within the other. This is like Jesus' ability to see in Peter someone who could become the rock on which I build my church, even in the midst of his shortcomings. The virtue of trust then triggers an intuitive desire. It focuses our attention and our awareness, and it provides the impulse to want to connect, to share with another person, to engage in playful interactions with them, that feeling of being together. Next, as we've already started to discuss, we feel an emotion that motivates us to approach. And this emotion involves certain kinds of feelings that energize us to approach and to be receptive to another person. These feelings can include things like enjoyment and self-confidence that creates a desire to be with someone and to do things with them. It can involve emotions like interest interest in what the other person has to offer or to share or what they've experienced. It creates the desire to attend to them, to ask them questions. And love, which creates the desire to explore, to savor experiences, and to grow together. And finally, the virtue of trust sets in motion particular procedural skills. These, again, we can think of these as habituated, so they develop over time, situation-specific skills, meaning I might exercise one skill in one moment, different one in another moment, that express trust in another person and that invite that person to trust in us. So we're going to dip our toes into a greater complexity for one moment, and then we're going to pause, come back out, and we will pause for questions there. So interestingly, even before we see, trust begins with a particular set of expectations. In fact, all seeing, and we don't have time to go into this now, anything that we see, even physical objects that we see, is grounded in what we expect to see in a moment. We have difficulty perceiving if we don't have a framework to understand what's in front of us. And so trust as well begins with a particular set of expectations developed over years of experiences and stored below the level of conscious awareness. The expectation that the other may be interested in me, may be open to me. Those who are open to that kind of reality are then able to see or attune to expressions of appreciation, of interest, maybe even the other person's willingness to sacrifice themselves for me. But they're not blind. The trusting individuals see with a balanced sensitivity to social and emotional cues. They're neither hyper attuned to threats, as we'll talk about someone who is anxiously attached to this, nor do they tend to avoid negative information. Instead, they can see the person in front of them as a whole person. These perceptual cues then trigger off what some would refer to as a moral barometer that helps us to intuitively decide, is it worth it to invest in this person or in this moment or to take a risk here? If so, trust then creates a sense of felt security, the sense that another person is not a threat to me, but instead may be interested in my activities or in my goals, or maybe even in my growth. This sense makes us more open to others, including, it turns out, those who are not like us. It makes us more open to see strangers and even enemies as potential neighbors. In turn, our felt security makes us less hostile to those who are different from us, makes us less hostile to the stranger. This sense then triggers a desire to move closer, to share something with another person, a desire to connect and even to play. But in order for this impulse to translate into action, we usually need a way to manage difficult moments and emotions. In other words, we need the capacity to regulate our emotions. And it turns out people with the virtue of trust, people who are chronically securely attached, tend to be able to regulate their emotions well. If we're well self-regulated, even difficult situations, even moments of conflict can provide opportunities for trust. And in turn, if a person has developed a stable sense of trust, then the anxious emotions that inevitably arise when we're in conflict with people can be more easily self-regulated, and one can continue to feel safe even in turbulent waters. When those feelings of safety are present, the desire to move closer can then be magnified by one or more feeling states. These include things like enjoyment, confidence, interest, love. Like I said before, enjoyment and confidence offer this kind of motivational fuel to just be with another person. Enjoying someone provides like a carrot to the relationship. It draws us toward contact and connection. And that feeling of confidence, self-confidence in the moment, allows us to move into unknown situations, stabilized by the belief that we can overcome challenges if they arise and move through moments of discomfort in our relationships. If we feel the feeling of interest, this motivates our tendency to want to attend to the other person, to ask questions, to kind of probe deeper in ways that elicit the other person's deeper self. The feeling of love, whether it's romantic love or platonic love, can spark a desire to explore with another person, to play, to savor the kind of experiences we have with them. And so when we have these emotions, they motivate particular behaviors. Two of those are called, one you've heard of, the other one maybe kind of a jargony term as well. One's called capitalization, and the other one is caring or trusting behaviors. So capitalization, you might not have heard that word, but we all have experienced this before. This is the word psychologists give to telling someone else about something good that happened in our life, telling someone else about something positive. And we allow that person to celebrate with us. It is one of the great joys of friendship. And it's actually one of the ways that we can continue to make use of positive events after they've happened in our life. Trusting also motivates caring behaviors. When we trust someone, that feeling leads us to more closely attune to the experiences and to the needs of another person in such a way that we can join with them in their experiences. And in the end, because of the ways that we as human beings are wired, this experience of interpersonal connection is intrinsically rewarding. We just feel good when we feel connected with another person. And it provides a feedback loop that makes us more likely to trust in future interactions. We feel good about ourselves and feel good about the other person. So maybe one way to move us into a moment, I'll pause there, a way to move us into a period of questions and give you time to formulate or think about any questions you may have is maybe think back on that failure of trust, either in your own life or that you witnessed in the life of one of your congregants from earlier. When you think about that failure that you observed, at which of these stages of trust might you or they have faced an obstacle? And that might help us. I think none of this is helpful if it doesn't help us to actually think practically about ourselves and our congregants. So if any of those sheds light on that moment of failure, wonderful. If it doesn't, ask a question, help clarify something, and we can dive in a little bit deeper. But I'll pause and in fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen I'll keep the screen up, give you a moment to take a look at all those different layers of trust as you think about your questions. And then Derek, feel free, if you have questions that have come to you, you can let me know and I'll
Sure.
pop the screen down in just a second.
Yeah, I got one that I'll get us out the gate here, and feel free to unmute and ask your own question if you have one coming up here. But so here's one I'll post in the chat.
Sure.
When trust is broken, what does the research suggest, or what might you offer in terms of rebuilding it? Is the pathway different for those anxious versus avoidant tendencies?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is actually what we're going to talk about in the second half. So I'll preview a little bit and then we're going to dive into it deeper. The short answer is there's brief in the moment interventions that help us to enter into situations with a little bit more trust than we might otherwise have. Those are what are called attachment priming, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That turns out actually to be effective for both anxious and avoidant, and actually really effective for people who are securely attached already, but just helps us to care better.
Hmm.
But yeah, there are sets of longer term interventions. So part of what I'll talk about is the ways in which we might structure one-on-one opportunities, either as a pastor with a congregant or small group opportunities in ways that can go well. Set those up for success versus for downward spirals, because really, if we have difficulty trusting, what the research suggests is the only way that changes is repeated time and time again experience of trustworthy others becoming slightly more and more vulnerable over time. So, and we can say more about that later. But I don't know if that helps to answer, if you'd have a follow-up question from that. Is that
Mm.
getting at a little
Uh,
bit of what you're wondering?
yeah, I think that's good. Is there another question? I have a few here, but I don't want to dominate all the space. Anyone have a question? There's a question that just popped up there in the chat from Jerry Kopp. How might these principles apply to trusting oneself
Oh
as
yeah,
well?
this is a great question. This is I think some of the most interesting research on this, and I won't do too much. I can nerd out for a while on this. Some of the most interesting research is has to do with experimental interventions. So these sort of in the moment interventions on what I mentioned before called attachment priming. And the reason I think it's so interesting is because it helps us to see cause and effect. So if you can actually do something and then see something different happen as a result of it, you become more confident that it's this intervention that's actually working. And one of the effects of priming attachment, and again, the short version I'll give to that right now is priming attachment is basically, in a nutshell, having you think about people that you have felt safe with before. It's what I had you do in the very beginning of this hour, mentally picturing a safe interaction, and ideally even savoring and re-experiencing that has been shown, amongst other things, to increase our sense of our own self-trust. And so I love that you brought that up. That actually shows in the research, and it's one of the things we can find changes when you implement attachment priming. Is that getting at what you were asking, or would you have a follow-up question to that?
That was Jerry who asked that. I don't know if he's in a place where he can unmute,
Okay.
but
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, it's a really insightful. And yeah, because oftentimes what goes wrong, there's these two interlock components in moments of trust. And one of them has to do with obviously what I expect of the other person. Are they going to be trustworthy? But the
Right.
second one is actually is that sense of, am I capable of navigating this situation in a way that I can ride through difficulties or disappointments or letdowns? And that self-trust piece is a core component that that yeah is has been shown to be developed by these trust interventions.
Thank you.
We got another question here from Christine Hung in the chat. I don't know if you can see that there, and I'll just read it out loud for those that can't read the chat. How does past trauma impact this framework? What about racialized trauma? How do you mitigate the impact?
Gosh, this is such a great question, Christine. So there is a robust literature suggesting that that experiences of trauma and really a lot of what manifests in what we call insecure attachment styles are early experiences of either small or big trauma, these sort of breaches in trust where I needed something and I was let down. And I think capital T trauma can induce those same difficulties in trust. And it makes sense, right? I mean, and this is part of why my hope was to engage with Jesus's question to Peter in a curious way,
Mm.
because I think the question, why do you doubt, isn't just a rhetorical one. I think there are oftentimes really good reasons why we have difficulty trusting. It's our body's way of protecting itself after we've been harmed, after we've, been vulnerable, and that vulnerability has been taken advantage of. So yeah, and I think with anything trust wise, we'll talk about forgiveness next time, and the same idea carries over to that. Um, I hope I hope you hear any intervention as being a balance between, and in fact, one of the things you find is as you develop attachment security, it actually decreases. So attachment priming decreases gullibility, which is really interesting because you sometimes think of overly trusting people as being too gullible. And the more secure you feel, some more you begin to respond following trauma. And actually, a lot of trauma interventions follow a model that tries to redevelop trust. You actually find gullibility going down, and so people can be more discerning in their interactions. There's so many directions I can go, though, Christine, with that question. I don't know if that's getting at some of what you're wondering, or if you'd have a follow up on that.
Well, no, that's really helpful. This whole idea of tone, and especially the tone that we um, w so often just place upon Jesus.
Yes.
I put in the comment, I wish we had access to Jesus sound bites to hear his tone in many of his one-liners in scripture. I believe it would change our theology radically.
Yes. Oh, I think that's such a helpful tip. We just in our Sunday school, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were reading through Genesis, and reading God's interactions with Adam and Eve. We just read it in three different voices, and it was very, very different experience to hear God ask, "Where have you gone? Where are you?" In a condemning tone versus in a curious and an inviting tone. So yeah, I agree.
I think this framework that you are presenting today, especially in such a polarized nation that we have, even in the church. I don't know if you're going to go there, but how, as pastors or church leaders, can use this framework to have really challenging conversations or to help congregations tether to one another, even across lines of difference, whether it's politically, ethnically, or whatnot. But it's really helpful content.
Yeah. And I think just to echo that last piece that you said, this is, even if I'm putting on my psychology hat for a moment, the data goes in that direction. That when we feel secure and safe, even just in these moment to moment attachment primings, we are more likely to reach across divides. We're more likely to be open to see the other as neighbor, as fully human. Some of the most fascinating studies, actually, Shaver and Michelantzer do their research in Israel and Palestine, and have been doing that for the last 20 years. And what they find is having Israeli guards primed with memories of their mothers. So they just ask them to think about their moms and then ask them to respond both hypothetically and in real situations to what they think are the outgroup Palestinians. They find increases in willingness to sacrifice for the outgroup just by thinking about moments in which they felt safe. So I think even in the most polarized situations we can imagine, I think there's data to suggest this is really helpful.
Ross, I'll
And
let you decide when you want to jump back into content. But there's perhaps there's one more comment there. I don't know if you want to address now or later, but I'll read it out loud again for those that aren't following the chat.
perfect.
When we have staff or community members that continuously self-sabotage, how do we effectively guide with grace? Or is there a point where we do what we can and understand that portion that is up to them to accept open, authentic, safe people and places?
Oh, this is such a great question. And actually maybe even a perfect one to launch us into what goes wrong sometimes and then
Mm,
what can we do. And I'll
mm.
give a bit of an abbreviated version of this so we can come back out and think about each one particularly. But let me jump in because I think that's a great question of when we think of self-sabotage, even to use Christine's language, what tone do we say that in our head? Is that a condemning, you're just sabotaging yourself? Or can we have empathy with someone who wants to do something and finds themselves not doing the very thing that they want to do? So let me jump back in and hopefully we can readdress that on the other side. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. There we go. Okay. So, in thinking about trust in the way that we have, it's helpful to think about some obstacles to trust, things that come up. So, I want to present just a couple. There's so many of these that we could go into, but I'm going to hold myself back and just identify a few and note where research has suggested this impacts the trusting process. And then we'll end with a few examples. And then Derek, when should when's our cutoff time? And so when I want to try to save at least 10 minutes for final questions and conversation.
Yeah, our cutoff time is I just need 5 minutes at the end, so 25. So that means at 10:15 probably from what
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. I will shoot to try to wrap this up at 10:15 then so we can spend last 10 minutes in questions.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things, and this may be tied in some ways to the ways in which we see people self-sabotage, is there's been just a robust set of research on loneliness. Um, Loneliness is, and it is, I mean, likely if you picked up a newspaper, you know, it is an epidemic in our country currently, and over the last 10, 15 years especially. Um, I think mediated in no small part by our rising dependence on electronic media, electronic communication, and so our lack of face-to-face contact with other people. But what we find is people who are lonely, not only does it not feel good, but they display a few characteristics in the trusting process. People who are lonely loneliness actually sends us into a fight flight mode. You could think, in fact, picture this for a moment. Imagine wherever you are right now that the air got sucked out of the room you were in, and all of a sudden you couldn't breathe at all. Think about what you would feel, what you would think, what you would do. Your mind would be panicked. You would be thinking either I'm going to die, you just sort of give up, or you would be thinking, where do I get air? And you would be launching yourself toward anything that even resembles breathable oxygen. In other words, your brain is in fight flight mode. And that's what happens in loneliness. When we lose the air, the oxygen of interpersonal connectedness, our brain goes into panic mode. And part of panic mode is it goes on threat alert mode. And so what we start to perceive in our environment is we become hyper attuned to possible social threats, signs that someone else dislikes us, or they may reject us, or they're judging us, or that they are threatening to us or our group in some way or another. They also find that lonely individuals tend to over interpret what's called relational noise as negative. Relational noise are ambiguous situations. It's where I say something to you. In fact, Zoom is such a perfect example of this. I say something to you, and then I see a bunch of people with unreadable expressions. And I don't know, are you thinking about it? Are you bored? Are you pondering it and you're curious? If I'm lonely, I am more likely than if I'm not lonely to interpret what your facial expression says as threatening. You're bored, you want to be out of here, you want to disengage, you're judging me, something like that. And so we find lonely individuals, one of the self-sabotages comes even at this perceptual level of seeing more threat than is really out there. They then go into, it actually tends to trigger one of two sets of intuitions in people. Sometimes depending on where we go back to in our moments of seeking safety, sometimes depending on what the situation calls for, but oftentimes it leads us to either withdraw or distance, or to try to control the relationship, and sometimes even in that controlling to become critical and demanding. One of the most revelatory moments in my life was when I learned about loneliness research, and I started to figure out that some of the students or some of the other adults I might encounter in my life who seemed to be the most irritable or frustrating were actually experiencing loneliness. They were in psychic pain in the moment. In fact, if you look at functional MRIs of people who are lonely, their brains light up in similar ways to people who are experiencing physiological pain. And so loneliness is one of the things that gets in the way. It interferes with our perceiving others accurately, and it leads us to then respond in ways that make it less likely that other people are going to engage with us in the future. You think if you have someone in front of you who's critical and demanding, or is trying to control a situation, or someone who's withdrawing, I am less likely to reach out to them and connect, and so they're more likely to stay perpetuated in that cycle of loneliness. So loneliness is one of the things that can get in the way. This loneliness triggers, I mentioned before, two different patterns of relational behavior. One of them we could just generally think about as anxious attachment. And so this oftentimes comes from inconsistent caregiving, but we can see the very same things that get elicited when we feel lonely or anxious in social situations, or when we've repeatedly had some people connect with us and then withdraw. So this doesn't just have to be parents, this can happen in our congregational lives and our work lives too. And so what happens is a series of different perceptions, emotions, and then behaviors. When we're anxiously attached, we tend to expect that others are uninterested in really seeing who I am. It's this belief that if people really knew me, they wouldn't want to engage with me. We tend to then, like people who are lonely, attune to signs of potential rejection. So I'm more likely to see people as rejecting even when they're not. If I'm anxiously attached, I nevertheless have this craving to be connected, and I'm willing to sacrifice all sorts of things just to feel connected. So it's harder for people to draw boundaries, for them to say no. It's harder for them to be authentic around other people because they have this ongoing sense that the other person is going to leave. If I'm not who they hope I am, then they're going to leave. And so they tend to operate, instead of on an intuition to connect, they have an intuition to try to control or to keep the person present. They tend to feel psychological pain when others suffer. So instead of feeling compassion, they're moved into this distress position when they see other people suffer, or when they're alone. And so they have a desire to compulsively fix relationships. Instead of feeling enjoyment or confidence or interest, they tend to feel anxious when they're with others and sort of constantly worried about, what do I need to do next to keep this relationship going? And they will oftentimes try to control, either by demanding signs of loyalty, by demanding affection, by trying to keep the other person together with them. And when they do caregive, they tend to find people who are anxiously attached are less likely to caregive out of the real needs of the person in front of them. And they do more compulsive caregiving, like quick fixes that try to just get that person back up to baseline. So they're less responsive to the underlying needs of another person. In a parallel way, I mentioned loneliness can also trigger off a pattern of behaviors that's similar to what we call avoidant attachment or avoidant relating. In this, instead of feeling like the self is unworthy, there's a gut expectation that other people are going to be untrustworthy. This usually comes from a series of ways in which people have been let down by caregivers or by others in their life. And sometimes the same pattern of attachment strikes those who've experienced trauma, or at least this pattern of relating with people who resemble the traumatizer. And so what they're going to attune to is, instead of those expressions of trustworthiness, we're very quick to see signs of potential selfishness, that person is in it for themselves. And so when they evaluate the relationship, it's just not worth it. Intimacy and vulnerability feel at those moments like this is not worth the potential risk, because I've got sense that I'm going to be let down, that the other person is going to be selfish, that they're not safe in this moment. And so I have an intuition to want to withdraw, to distance. The kind of feeling state, or the desire in here, is I just want freedom. I want to be alone. If I'm just in my own space, I don't have to worry about anyone else. That's what that avoidant feeling brings up in us. And like those who are anxiously attached, they tend to feel more distress when other people suffer or when other people are vulnerable. And so they will tend to distance and disengage themselves from vulnerable others. Interestingly enough, avoidantly attached individuals also have the hardest time themselves feeling in need. They have a really hard time feeling gratitude, because gratitude means I've received something from someone else. And so it's hard to engage in these reciprocal relationships. So instead, they feel controlled or sometimes overwhelmed by others. They can still enjoy being around others, but it's when needs come up, when there's vulnerability expressed, or closeness, this is when they start to get more panicked and tend to want to distance. And so they disengage from the needs around them, and they disengage with their own needs inside. And in fact, they're much less likely than others to feel rewarded by connection. Instead, connection kind of feels anxious, or they can even sometimes feel shame if they've received something from someone else. As Christine brought up earlier, trauma, unresolved conflict with other people, or trauma, can actually result in very similar patterns of emotions and thoughts and behaviors. Let's see. Instead of pausing for questions right here, I'm going to give us 10 minutes at the end, and maybe I'll just mention a couple of ways that we might think about overcoming some of these obstacles. How do we cultivate trust, in other words? And then we'll pause for the last 10 minutes. One set of research actually revolves around how to go about helping lonely people. And I think it's really interesting. What they find is actually the single most helpful intervention for people who are lonely is helping them at the level of what they perceive. This is what are called social cognitive interventions. They tend to be 3 times as effective as anything else I'm about to mention here. But it is helping people question their negative assumptions that they have about other people. So that gut feeling I have that you're going to let me down, or that your neutral expression on a Zoom means that you're rejecting me or means that you're disinterested. Part of what this involves is having people pause and reimagine that underneath whatever that person is showing, there may be a more complex set of emotions and thoughts. But in addition to that, one of the things that we can do is to simply offer opportunities for social engagement. And these, especially for people who are avoidantly attached, the best social engagement are fun, they are light, they're just opportunities to be face to face with other people. Like our church a couple of weeks ago had a pie and board game night. And it was just one of those nights I got to sit down with 7 people that I don't interact very much with and just just have fun, just enjoy them. Also offering social support, and this may come in the form of pastoral counseling, or even having or referring to a therapist outside. And sometimes that counseling can involve social skills training. Although what we find is actually lonely people, even if they're sometimes critical and demanding, it's not that they don't know how to interact. It's that because they're in fight-flight mode, they're not using the skills that they already have. But one of the most helpful ways, just to reiterate that, to help in these moments is to help pause people in the moment of assuming that they know what that other person is thinking or feeling, and help them imagine more positive, trustworthy interpretations. In addition to that, there is a robust literature on what I called earlier attachment priming. And I won't say too much about it. I'll give you 2 examples of what attachment priming is, and then maybe mention just a couple things that it's associated with. But attachment priming can involve having someone recall a moment when they felt safety or security or connection. And ideally, like I had you guys do in the beginning, you want to actually get people to re-experience this. And so just having moments in the life of the congregation when people get an opportunity to talk about people who love them well and experiences of love. This is made even better if it happens to be expressions of gratitude between people within a congregation. That turns out to actually deepen trust even more effectively. This can also be done, though, independently. You don't have to do this interpersonally. You can write about a person who made you feel safe. And in doing so, thinking about what was the context that I was in the moment where I felt that safety. There's a piece of this called mental subtraction, where you have them imagine, what if they hadn't been there? What would that have been like? And then thinking about that, having them re-welcome that experience or that memory back in. And part of what this helps to do is to prime an abundance mindset, this feeling of there's plenty, I am loved, I'm full, I can be full of this experience and that memory of love. There are a few different emotions that we can that tend to trigger trust. So I won't go into how to do that, but one of them is gratitude. The more we can get people to experience and express gratitude, the more we tend to trust others. Another one of those is called relational savoring, where you can just pause in or after moments of connection and help people appreciate even just small moments of connection between one another and savor that. Makes the experience last and deepen in our memories. The final one is called moral elevation. The short version of this is the emotion we get when we hear stories told about moral beauty or moral goodness. And so this is oftentimes what you all do in sermons is we get the chance to collectively be morally elevated. And it turns out that when we experience that moral elevation about hearing of the good deeds of another person, it builds our desire to connect with people like that and to trust in others. And maybe I'm going to end on this one. There's one or two other ones we could do, but I'll pause in just a moment here. This is my favorite phrase. Two words. My students in my class, they get sick of me saying this, but I say it every single day. Part of my goal in my senior level capstone class is to develop trust, is to actually habitually practice trusting people. And so I'm going to leave you, even just if you remember only one thing, maybe remember this phrase. This comes from Erik Erikson. He says, intimacy, or what builds trust, is the capacity to share uncomfortably comfortable information with another and to receive feedback on one's strengths and one's weaknesses. And so uncomfortably comfortable is it's tuning us to helping ourselves to tune into what feels uncomfortable enough that I'm risking something, I'm entrusting someone else with something, but comfortable enough that I don't feel totally vulnerable in having shared it. So trying to have someone determine for themselves, or a whole group determine for themselves, what is a little bit of trustworthy information, but not so much that we're going to have a vulnerability hangover, when we all leave here. So that might be one. There's a few others we could think about. Let me see if there's any other last one. I would say just in general, and I don't want to go through all these details, but I think one of the most practical, you could think of it as ecologies that we can cultivate within the church, is ways in which people get the opportunity to interact either one-on-one or in small groups. And especially in ways where we can set expectations that other people can be trusted in little ways to begin with. So set ground rules. In fact, this oftentimes allows opportunities for gratitude and common goals. But when we set ground rules of not oversharing to begin, we kind of set the expectation that trust is something that we can invest, but also gets earned over time. And I think helping people to calibrate that, this goes back a little bit to think about Christine's question about people who have gone through trauma or have been experienced systematic oppression. You don't want to encourage just gullible and trusting of everything. But what is risking enough that I'm giving someone else the chance to show up in a trustworthy way without risking so much that I'm going to get devastated or re-injured if they let me down. In other words, redefining what is worth it as what's worth a little bit more risk. And that usually involves setting those kind of ground rules. Ideally, when you run a group like this, you want to be able to model low risk sharing, model playfulness, engagement with other people, and give people chances to take breaks from intimacy, especially avoidantly attached people. Give chances for them to sort of peel back and reflect personally, or go up into their minds, go a little cognitive for a moment. And ideally, the more that leaders can model those emotions and the more leaders can help facilitate connections, the better. And ideally, the more you can have opportunities for times of gratitude to be expressed. And I think actually even prayers, both of praise and of need, our chances for people to kind of practice caring behaviors. Okay, so I'll stop with that. I'm gonna stop sharing here so I can see all of your faces. Any questions? We have about 7 minutes left before we let Derek wrap us up. Any questions or pushback? I always love pushback on any of this. Would love to hear thoughts. And Derek, I'm not monitoring the chat. If there's anything in the chat you think you want to
Yeah,
pop up.
I'm watching the chat. I think folks are just waiting. They don't want to be the first one. So if you got a question, go ahead and launch it out there. I have a few on deck here that I'll ask if we don't hear from someone. So how does a leader's own attachment style show up in their ability to foster trust with their own team or organization? I think you touched on this a bit, but maybe yeah, maybe a little bit more about that.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's many directions I think we could go with this. I haven't looked specifically into attachment and leadership styles. That is its whole distinct area of research, though, so that's not my area of expertise. What I
Mm,
will say is what I've witnessed and some of the overlap that I see in the literature is um, a leader's expectation and narrative of what to expect from others, what appropriate responses are from other people, their modeling of how to relate is contagious and it trickles
mm,
down. And so,
mm,
if you have, for instance, a leader that is, just to name a category, avoidantly attached. So, someone who is another word for that we call is counter dependent. They want to be independent, they want to be free. They're less likely to model vulnerability. They're less likely to model a sense of deep openness and risk taking with others. Maybe more likely to perceive out group members as
mm,
being more stereotypically negative in some way or another, and so that may translate on down in small ways or in explicit ways through a sermon or through leadership, kind of orders or demands. They're
mm,
yeah, again, less likely to make themselves vulnerable. And so to rely on other people within their leadership team is going to be particularly painful. It's hard for them to express gratitude. And so that's going to make for a very different experience as a member of a leadership team if you're not hearing thanks for the things that you're contributing. Those are just a few thoughts that come off the top of my mind, but I don't know if you want to dive deeper into any one of those.
mm. Well, there's a few other questions on
Sure.
deck here, so I'll let people unmute and interrupt me. But what about differences when it comes to gender? Does research show us anything, especially in relation to trust, symbiosis, avoidance? Like, does it look different based on gender?
This is a great question. So the one piece with gender that I have on the top of my mind, and I will punt an explicit research-based answer for anything else. But the one I know that I most recently read in the research where they expected attachment priming to work different. So like remember what it was like to be close with your mom or with a caregiver or with someone trustworthy. They thought this would look differently in genders, and what they found is in a major meta-analysis that examined over 100 different studies, there was no interaction effect for gender, meaning this kind of priming of trust works equally well in men and women to prime different kinds. I didn't even mention the kind of behaviors that we typically tend to see
Mm,
in that kind of attachment priming. But these are things like caring behaviors, pro-social behaviors, decreases in aggression towards outgroup members, increase in openness to other perspectives, and that sort of like works equally well between genders. I would imagine that how that looks in different genders is probably also even further contextualized by the culture in which those genders appear. There are some cultures that tend to promote greater gender role differences, and you have different kind of habitual ways of being as a male and
mm.
female in some cultures that don't show up in others. So I would be reticent to make any broad claims about how that would show up in genders, but I can imagine that interacting with gender stereotypes and roles.
Mm.
I can, I can I can freestyle on that one if you want me to, but I'm going off research at this point. So,
That's great. Um, Let me also open it up. It looks like Jerry Kopp has a question there as well, so I'll read that in a moment, but also open it up for any comments or connections. It doesn't have to be curiosity seeking more information. If someone would like to just kind of out loud connect the dots or maybe some epiphanies that are emerging for them in relation to this content, that also facilitates our collective learning. But Jerry's question here, is there research demonstrating a relationship between trust in God, people of faith, and ability to trust others? Like, yeah.
yes, I'm so glad. I don't know, Jerry, if you were teeing me up for this or not, but there's actually a really nice developing research over the last 20 years, some of it coming from Todd Hall and his colleagues. Todd Hall is at Biola University. And he's looked at the differences between God image and God concept. And this is, and then how that relates to our own attachment experiences with a caregiver and our trust in current relationships. And what he's found is that that our attachment style, so to speak, and all the like parenting and the kind of environmental experiences that lead me to be insecurely attached or securely attached don't tend to predict my orthodoxy or my beliefs about God, what he calls my God concept. So, in other words, I can have securely and insecurely attached people who both believe God is a merciful, trustworthy God. But where you see the effect is in God, what I say, God image. So not God
Mm.
concept, which is sort of cognitive, God image, which is our emotional, intuitive gut feelings about what God is like. And so
Mhm.
individuals who have been inconsistently parented or who feel disconnected and have that sort of attachment insecurity are more likely, even if they know or they say my theology is God is trustworthy and merciful, to feel at a gut level like God is just waiting to catch me doing something wrong and I should be ashamed and I want to distance myself from God. So there is in that direction a substantial relationship. And this is one where and this is where I think some of the Wesleyan understandings of social grace and prevenient grace and kind of how God prepares our hearts through the relationships with others. I think this is a way in which attachment research and what's called earned attachment, where even if we're insecurely attached to begin with, a series of trusting and trustworthy interactions over the span of months or years can actually bring about a more secure sense of attachment. And that's one where I think, and I haven't seen earned attachment with then my theology with God. I would suspect though you would begin to see that reconvergent where people who experience in congregational settings increased sense of trustworthiness and closeness that can begin to trust in others are going to evidence that same kind of gut feeling, God image feeling about God as a trustworthy God. So that's where it gets to speculation. Is that last link? I haven't seen earn attachment studied in that way, but it's a great question.
Well, there's just one final question, maybe a minute to respond. We have some CPL royalty in the room here, both John Calhoun and Ron Benefiel, former directors of this office. So, John's question here about divorce recovery and some of the material that you've been presenting on. Any thoughts on its role in divorce recovery? John, feel free to edit that question if I'm not representing that well.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Gosh, this is a great question. So this is one where I'm stepping out of my realm of expertise a little bit. And so where I will say is in the realm of what I know is in the realm of marital interventions, marital research. So while people are still a couple, there is a substantial overlap between this. A lot of the work of John Gottman up at the University of Washington has done actually great laboratory work and great longitudinal studies looking at how some of these moment to moment trust based interactions that either succeed or fail end up predicting long term marital satisfaction and success. I would suspect in divorce recovery, but this is where I'm not speaking out of the research at this point, that you would, I mean, divorce recovery involves a redeveloping the trusting process. And I think it would be short-sighted to think one could just jump back into relationships without being able to readdress and to kind of rework in that kind of earned attachment later. But I don't know the direct research on there, but it's a really, really good question. I would suspect there's a strong overlap between there.
Well, we have 2 minutes left till our time boundary, so I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Ross Oaks-Mueller, for your time and your knowledge that you've shared with us. And I think you're going to begin to see some expressions of gratitude roll in the chat here in a minute. So